Hello, my name is Daniel Lee and I will be talking to you today about augmenting popular music education with jazz pedagogies and content. This presentation is a product of my recent PhD research at the University of Tasmania. The Chambers 21st Century Dictionary defines augment as to make or become greater. Their definition of great is outstandingly talented and much admired and respected. This paper examines the question, does the inclusion of jazz content in a popular music course increase the talent, admiration or respect of the graduates? Much of the existing literature focuses on comparisons between pedagogies used in jazz and popular music and how they overlap with institutionalized education. In the year 2000, Hannon produced a report on the then current state of popular music tertiary education in Australia. He observed what he described as historically and stylistically inappropriate pedagogical practices and coined the term jazz virus to describe his findings. He found many educators who were at the time employed to deliver CPM courses had themselves been educated in jazz performance. He observed these educators tended to indoctrinate their own students with jazz aesthetics. A second indicator of the jazz virus is the pedagogical practices of teaching students to read and write charts. Hannon stated, and I quote, "Most popular musicians learn to play music by ear, either imitating recorded music or learning originals from their co-musicians. Charts are a legacy of the jazz era. They are anachronistic in the post-MIDI era." End quote. Other literature supports Hannon's claims that most popular musicians learn to play by ear. This study was conducted in the form of a phenomenographically oriented ethnography. The scope of the study included 25 courses at Australian Qualifications Framework Level 7 bachelor degree courses, in which a student could select to major in contemporary or popular music performance, with the guitar as their primary instrument. At the time of data collection, Semester 1, 2018, there were 17 universities, 3 TAFE colleges, and 5 private institutions offering courses that fit the scope of the study. Data were collected from 3 sources, from surveys, interviews, and industry documents. 66 participants responded to the online survey for alumni and students. 18 participants responded to the online survey for educators. Interviews were conducted via recorded telephone conversations with 32 participants. The data corpus was analysed using the procedures of inductive thematic analysis as described by Brown and Clark, with further methodological support from the works of Sarantakos and Bryman. 5 themes were generated from the data. Be yourself. Students are encouraged to develop their own voice. Global spectra. The internet has had a profound influence on both music and education, breaking down geographical boundaries. Vast array. Among the 25 courses examined, diverse curriculum designs and content were observed. Style agnostic. Defining contemporary popular music, or CPM, was found to be difficult. Some course designers have embraced this difficulty and incorporate undefined genre boundaries into the course curricula. This paper discusses the theme jazz symbiosis, where many courses were found to incorporate jazz content and associated pedagogical practices. Indicators of jazz content were observed in 61% of the courses examined. Jazz content indicators found in the data include the word jazz being used in unit descriptors, interviews and surveys, the presence of improvisation in curricula and assessments, jazz musicians being listed by students and alumni as influential on their performance practices, jazz-trained persons and practitioners being employed to deliver contemporary popular music courses, and guest jazz musicians being hired to deliver workshops and masterclasses, and finally, transcriptions of artists' improvised solos as a pedagogical practice. Jazz content was found in all 3 datasets and from sources affiliated with all institution types, exemplified by the following data extracts. This one from a Box Hill TAFE unit descriptor, an educator survey respondent, and a university student interviewee. It was also found that jazz content tended to be more prominent as the course progressed. A greater presence of jazz was often observed in the later years of sample courses. Barry, a university educator interviewee, made this observation. And Michael, also a university educator interviewee, said this. In keeping with Hanan's findings, now more than 20 years ago, current educators in Australian CPM courses were still found to primarily have jazz backgrounds. It was found educators affiliated with CPM courses typically either had formal training in jazz performance and/or experience in the jazz performance industry. Barry noted his institution has had Jim Kelly teaching the guitar for the majority of his course. Paul, a private institution educator interviewee, stated jazz is his emphasis. The presence of jazz-trained educators in one case also influenced the course design as the course evolved, augmenting the course design during the regular updates. James observed that this may be because Australian jazz musicians seek employment as educators as an income stream, often because it's very hard to make a living, so they're drawn to institutions to survive. Guest artists hired to deliver masterclasses and workshops to students in popular music courses were often jazz musicians from either Australia or internationally. Australian jazz musicians hired to deliver workshops or masterclasses included James Muller, Vince Jones, Stephen Magnuson, Peter Petrucci, and Tony Gould. Jazz-oriented guest lecturers from the United States of America hired to present masterclasses in popular music courses included Herbie Hancock, John Schofield, Joshua Redman, and the Brooklyn-based ensemble Snarky Puppy. Two of the courses examined in the study explicitly include both popular music and jazz in the title. The course from Central Queensland University and from the University of Tasmania. Other courses were also found to combine jazz and popular music, however, in their unit descriptors, including this sample from Box Hill TAFE and this one from Victoria University. In some cases, this also included classical music and world music. This data sample from Melbourne Polytechnic presents jazz compositions being integral to the technical repertoire. In a challenge to the implications of the virus terminology employed by Hanan in 2000, this study found, nearly 2 decades later, that student interviewees are now typically appreciative of the perspective of the inclusion of jazz theory and what it had given them in their popular music training. We will come back to the access to jazz issue in a few minutes. Warren, a university student interviewee, stated he was inspired by the jazz content. Some course designers have adopted jazz pedagogical approaches and adapted them to apply to popular music, while some have avoided using jazz pedagogies. Instructing students in jazz theory was seen as beneficial to their ability to communicate with musicians from other genres. Jazz influences were also seen as a form of diversification to help broaden the scope of courses within a popular music focus. Improvisation is a fundamental component of jazz. The Chambers 21st Century Dictionary defines jazz as a type of popular music of Black American origin with strong, catchy rhythms performed with much improvisation. Palmer states although many genres and traditions utilize improvisation as an integral component of performance, none appears more prominently featured than jazz improvisation. Improvisation exists in popular music, however its presence is less overt. Improvisation in popular music is almost exclusively the role of the lead guitarist in a rock ensemble. Also, it has been observed that the presence of an improvised guitar solo in commercial popular music is becoming increasingly rare. Regarding the role of improvised guitar solos in the current industry, Murray, a senior lecturer in guitar at the Melbourne Conservatorium, stated, 21st century pop in general is not bursting with shredding electric guitar virtuosi. It could therefore be argued that the presence of improvisation in current popular music courses is an indicator of jazz influence more than contemporary popular music practice or industry relevance. Elements of improvisation were found to be present across the entire range of courses from all sample strata, including the private institution educator interview, a TAFE unit descriptor, a university unit descriptor, and a student survey response. Transcribing another musician's improvised solo and performing transcribed solos are common accepted pedagogical practice in jazz education. However, it is also acknowledged that transcribing is not exclusive to jazz pedagogy and is also typical of popular music education. Lucy Green states, quote, "By far the overriding learning practice for beginner popular musicians is to copy recordings by ear." End quote. However, there was an observed relationship between transcribing and jazz content in the data. William, a student at Australian National University, listed 4 jazz guitarists as artists whose improvised solos he transcribed during his studies. Transcribing was also found to be an assessed skill among Australian CPM courses. An important observation supporting transcribing as a jazz content indicator was reference to transcribing, and the performance of transcribed solos was not found in the data affiliated with institutions that did not feature other jazz indicators. Although a few students resented the jazz content, more were found to have positively embraced jazz and were appreciative of the perspective jazz content brought to them. This also extended to networks and jazz communities they interacted with as a result of their education and new directions their performance style has taken in response. Jamie Lee observed her training in jazz theory influenced how she views music. James observed that jazz is a valuable tool for developing a white Australian musician's ability to express themselves individually. Australian popular music aesthetics have long been influenced by international multi-genre sources. The presence of jazz content in Australian guitar education may be a natural and perhaps intrinsic result of Australian popular music's eclectic nature. Ian Moss, lead guitarist of Cold Chisel, is often regarded as one of Australia's best rock guitar players. He has been described as employing jazz elements in his performance style. Therefore, jazz elements in Australian CPM guitar education may not be out of place. The presence of jazz symbionts in Australian popular music courses may in fact be building on pre-existing cultural heritage. For example, Chris Cheney, frontman of the multiple ARIA award-winning band The Living End, is also regarded as one of Australia's best rock guitarists, and he demonstrates jazz elements in his performance practice. For example, the introduction to his 1998 composition Closing In is almost identical to the introduction to Nick Lucas's 1922 composition Teasing the Frets. Cheney is an alumnus of the course at Box Hill TAFE and would have been exposed to the jazz content in the curricula of that course. Therefore, as Cheney is now regarded as highly influential in the Australian guitar community, the jazz content can be seen as having had a direct reciprocal impact on other members of the community who now undertake to emulate Cheney's performance practices. Through his adoption and dissemination of jazz performance practices, it can be argued that the jazz content in the Box Hill course has augmented the Australian popular music voice. The wording used in unit descriptors implies a spirit of augmentation. By engaging with jazz pedagogy and content, the new knowledge referred to above is deemed to augment the existing knowledge of the student cohort. In deference to Hanan's employment of the virus terminology, the findings of this research have revealed something more akin to a symbiotic relationship between jazz and popular music at the institutional level. Students of Australian popular music courses have embraced the jazz content and included jazz aesthetics in their voice. Also, course designers and educators recognise the value of jazz theory for popular musicians. Educated participants see jazz as a natural progression for popular musicians who wish to improve or augment their skill sets. Equity of access to higher education. Hanan stated, tertiary music training has been traditionally limited to middle-class students with a classical music background, most of whom qualify for university entry on the basis of their privately funded individual music lessons. The wide range of course designs developed by the Australian tertiary popular music sector provides prospective students with a range of options, particularly if they do not wish to undertake music education in a traditional conservatoire setting. This competition is significant culturally, sociologically and economically, and particularly significant when considering the potential for international student markets in Australia. This approach provides greater equity of access to tertiary music education by offering students from diverse backgrounds access to educational designs that may better suit them as individuals. Often in an effort to distance popular music education from the conservatoire model, institutions are exploring pedagogical ideas and designing new curricula. This in turn has allowed for greater student autonomy. For example, the course at Southern Cross University, being not genre-driven or canonised, enables students to bring a broader scope of eclectic influences to their repertoire, including jazz. This has the potential to encourage Australian guitar students to maximally explore their own voice. This demonstrates UNESCO's second aim for arts education, to develop individual capabilities. Also, as being oneself is a culturally significant component of Australian CPM, the study's findings reveal that the Australian tertiary sector is also demonstrating UNESCO's first aim of arts education, to uphold the human right to education and cultural participation. This finding is enhanced when regarded in conjunction with the equity of access to higher music education. Employing jazz pedagogies in popular music courses allows an equity of access to jazz for students from a non-jazz background. It also, as James observed, helps justify contemporary popular music education at higher institutions. Some students were aware of the jazz content prior to enrolling in their chosen course, and this was expressed as a deciding factor by some. One student interviewee moved interstate to attend a particular course for that very reason. Thus, jazz pedagogies have demonstrably augmented student numbers in popular music courses. To conclude, by coining the term jazz virus, Hanan's original observation could be interpreted to imply a negative influence. However, as has been demonstrated by data collected in this study, such a perception is not always the case. This study found a predominantly positive attitude toward jazz content in Australian popular music courses, and suggests jazz content has now become more appreciated by affiliates within these courses. Educators and students expounded the benefits of jazz influence on Australian popular music higher education curriculum design, and how it may be maintaining and even augmenting existing Australian cultural practice. The jazz content has augmented the courses in a number of ways, including student numbers, enhancing the performance practices of graduates, and influencing the Australian voice in guitar communities. Rather than a virus that infects its host, the jazz content could be regarded as more of a symbiont that offers a mutually beneficial service. The jazz content is making popular music greater in a number of ways, and in return the courses are exposing more students to jazz material, thereby feeding the jazz industry with more interested and well-educated partakers and practitioners. Thanks for listening.